Hi there guys, got a video here today on the FX M4, and what I'm going to be doing in today's video is just running through the trigger adjustment process as well as going over some troubleshooting tips. Now before we get into that, there are just a few things I want to mention. So firstly, the M4 is unique from the other older Impact models in that it has a true two-stage trigger. The older Impacts, like the M3 and the ones that come before it, did have a one-stage trigger with a fake second stage just in the back. However, the M4 actually has a few new sears and a couple of other components in the trigger, which enable it to be a true two-stage trigger. The other thing that I want to mention is that the trigger itself has 3 weight settings. So you have match, standard, and then hunting. The only difference between these 3 modes is the trigger weight. So this rifle here is currently set up in match mode, and the trigger weight is around 8 ounces. If we were to swap over to the standard mode, the trigger weight would increase to about 16 ounces. And then the hunting mode would be heavier than that. So the trigger weight is just a personal setting. This rifle here pretty much lives on a bench. It's never going to go out in the field, so I want a nice light trigger, and this one is currently set in match mode. The only difference between the 3 modes is the grub screw position, and when we get the trigger plate out, I'll show you exactly where that is. What we'll do first is go over the adjustments with the trigger plate out of the rifle, so I'll get that removed, then bring you back. Right then, so here's just a quick look at the trigger plate. The only thing I wanted to mention before we get started is that I have replaced the original trigger shoe with one of the ones that I sell on eBay. So this one looks a little different from the factory one, but we can put that over to one side. So up next, we'll just run through each of the grub screws. At the front here, we have this one here. This one controls the position of the trigger plate as well as our first stage travel. The next 2 grub screws, these 2 here, control our second stage. So the first one stays in place throughout all the 3 settings. Then the next one is the brake for the second stage, which can be moved from the match setting, this one here, to the standard setting, this position here, or the hunting position, this position at the back here. So to go through the trigger modes, all you do is move that grub screw to any one of those 3 holes. Then at the back here we also have the safety. So this one is just the safety grub screw, which stops the trigger from being pulled when the rifle is on safe. If we wanted to change this trigger from, say, the match setting over to the hunting setting, all we would need to do is move this grub screw, this one here, over to this hole here. That would increase the trigger weight and set the trigger into hunting mode. If we wanted to go from hunting mode to standard mode, we'd just need to move the grub screw from this position to this position in the middle here. The only other hole in the trigger plate is this one here. This hole isn't threaded at all, and it's just used to access a factory adjustment inside the trigger well, and that one doesn't need to be adjusted by the end user. And that can be viewed in the bottom of the rifle. So we'll take a quick look there. It's just that grub screw there, but that doesn't need to be changed by the end user, so we can leave that alone. The only other things I'll mention is that the trigger post can be slid up and down the trigger plate by just loosening the clamp screw, and then the trigger shoe can be moved by loosening the clamp. Then it can be moved up and down the post as well as twisted for your personal preference. The last screw is just this one here, and this one just holds this wheel in position and gives the trigger plate a pivot point. What we'll do next is put the trigger plate back in the rifle, and we'll go through the adjustments, and I'll show you what each of them actually does. Right then, with the trigger plate reinstalled into the rifle, I'll just get you a quick look at the trigger mechanism. You can't see much of it unfortunately through the block, although you can see one of the 2 new sears, this one in the middle. There's also a smaller one just below it, but there we have that there. Right then, starting off with the adjustments, first thing we're going to do is take a 1.5mm Allen key, and we can use this for all of the trigger plate adjustments. Starting off with this grub screw in the front of the unit just there, winding this out or counterclockwise allows the trigger plate to fall down more and gives you more first stage travel. Winding the screw in or clockwise moves the trigger plate into the rifle and reduces the first stage travel. If this grub screw is wound too far in, the trigger will be jammed in position and you may not be able to fire the rifle. And if it's too far out, the trigger will contact with the trigger guard and it may allow one of the internal sears to drop down and jam the trigger into position. Our next two screws, so these two here, both control the second stage. And these two screws need to be adjusted relative to one another. So typically speaking, if you make a change to one, you may have to make a change to the other one, but that's not always necessary. I'll explain what they both do though. So the forward grub screw, this one here, controls the movement of the second stage sear as well as the release point. Typically speaking, you're not really going to be adjusting this one. Once it's set and the trigger is working, most of the adjustment is done using the other screw, the one just behind it. But for now, I'll mention that if this screw is wound too far in, you may not be able to cock the rifle, and if it's too far out, then you may not be able to fire the rifle. Our next screw in line controls the creep or the appearance of the second stage. So that's that one there. And as this trigger is in match mode, the grub screw is in this position. If the rifle was in the standard mode, the grub screw would be in this position. And if it was in hunting mode, the grub screw would be right at the back. Typically speaking, this screw here is used to control the creep on the second stage. If this grub screw is wound too far in, you'll have a bit of second stage creep, and if it's wound too far out, you may not have a second stage wall on the rifle. Typically speaking, if you have a bit of creep on the second stage, you just need to wind this grub screw out a little bit, and then recheck the trigger, making real fine sort of 1/16 of a turn adjustments at a time until you get rid of the creep. If your trigger doesn't have a second stage, it just means that this grub screw has been wound too far out and you just need to go in a little bit until you get your second stage back once again. Our last grub screw, the one at the back, controls our safety, so that's just that grub screw just in front of the regulator. If this grub screw is wound too far out, you'll be able to pull the trigger whilst the rifle is on safe, and if it's wound too far in, you may not be able to fire the rifle. But once it's set, you typically don't need to touch that. The next thing we're going to be doing is going through some troubleshooting tips, and the first thing I'll do is poorly adjust the trigger so that it no longer works as it's supposed to. Then what we'll do is reset the trigger nicely so that it's working exactly how we want it to. Right then, I've gone through and really poorly adjusted the trigger. As you can see there, the trigger plate is way misaligned with the actual body. The rifle doesn't cock in any way, and overall it's just a big mess. Not to worry though, it's nice and simple to fix. The first thing we're going to do is take a look at each of the grub screws and wind them out just past the trigger plate. So for now, I'm going to be leaving the safety grub screw where it is. We can wind these two grub screws out, just these two here, so that they're sticking out from the plate about 1 millimeter or 2. Then we'll do the same for this one, although it's already wound out, so I'll leave that where it is. Right then, upon doing that, you can see the trigger plate has moved backwards inside the block. However, there is an awful lot of movement there still, so the next thing we'll do is set the position of the trigger plate by adjusting this forwardmost grub screw. Whilst we're here, I'll also get you a quick look at the grub screw positions, so you can just see what I'm working with there. So for now, we'll be adjusting that forwardmost grub screw. And what we're going to be doing is setting the trigger plate to a rough position. So winding the screw in nice and carefully. And as you can see there, the trigger plate is moving back. And for now, I'm just going to leave it there. So we still have a little bit of movement, but as you can see, the trigger plate isn't wobbling all over the place. The next thing I'll do is see if the rifle now cocks, which it does. The next thing we'll do is see if the rifle fires. So as you can see there, we've got the rifle on fire, but the rifle won't fire. To fix that, what I'm going to do is nice and firmly hold the cocking arm back whilst adjusting this forwardmost screw in the trigger. What we're going to be doing here is just winding this 1/4 of a turn in at a time, then rechecking our trigger. As you do this, be nice and careful, just so the rifle doesn't go off as you're adjusting the trigger. And as you can see there, we've got to the point where the rifle fires. The next thing we'll do, as at the moment the trigger itself is a 1-stage trigger with no stop. So the next thing we'll do is put in a 2nd stage by adjusting this grub screw here. What we're going to be doing is leaving the rifle uncocked, winding this screw in 1/4 of a turn at a time until we get a 2nd stage stop. And there we have it. After about 2 or 3 turns, we have a 2nd stage stop, although we do have a little bit of creep on that 2nd stage, so we're just going to nice and carefully adjust that out, just until we have a 2nd stage stop, but there's not excessive amounts of movement to get it to fire. And there we have it. So we've got a nice wall to the 2nd stage, but there's no extra movement to get the rifle to fire. To be honest with you, it's a little difficult to explain, but once you start feeling the trigger, you're going to be able to feel for creep really quite easily. But there we have it. So we have a nice short 1st stage there, then a nice wall to the trigger, and the rifle fires quite nicely. Obviously at this point we could adjust the 1st stage to whatever we wanted. So if we wanted less 1st stage travel, we'd simply need to wind this forwardmost grub screw in slightly, and if we wanted more 1st stage travel, we'd need to wind it out slightly. The next thing we can do is check the safety. So if we cock the rifle, pull the trigger, we can see it fires. If we flick the rifle on safe, so just on this side here, we flick the rifle on safe, then cock the rifle and try to fire it. You can see that the rifle fires whilst on safe. So to fix that, all we need to do is adjust this scrub screw at the back here in slightly. I'm going to be doing that with a 1.5mm ball-ended Allen key, nice and carefully. Right then, and after a little bit of adjustment, you can see that the trigger, it won't fire when the rifle is on safe. We can properly give the trigger a nice yank there, the rifle's not firing. However, if we flick it off safe, we can fire the rifle normally. So there we have our trigger set back to a usable standard. Right then, and there we have it. So I've spent a little bit more time and I've got the trigger exactly how I like it. Nice short 1st stage and a nice crisp break on the 2nd. What I'll do lastly is just bring over my trigger weight gauge and we'll see what the weight of the trigger is. So as you can see, they're just under 8 ounces, which from a rifle like this is perfectly acceptable. Again, if we wanted it heavier, we could also move the grub screw position over to the standard position, and that would give us a trigger roughly weighing in at around 16 ounces. I haven't checked the weight when the trigger is in the hunting position, however I'm guessing that's going to be around 2 pounds, as that's what the website indicates. But with that all said and done, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Overall, the new trigger on the M4 is definitely one of the big selling points of the M4 for me personally. The trigger on the older rifles was serviceable, however, the new one on the M4 is much better. With that all said and done, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting or useful, and I'll see you in the next one.